Describe to me what a B Corp is in 5 words or less.
Oh, yes. B Corps are better for the world.
Overachiever.
All right, I did it.
You did it.
Oh, yeah. What's your response?
Prioritizing people, planet, then profits.
So much better than mine.
N-
But you had time to prep.
I had time to prep.
I love it.
Thank you for sitting down with me. And to our listeners, welcome to Getting Down to Business, a B Corp podcast that's taking you inside of the journey of what it means to become a B Corp, why it matters, and how business gets certified, and what is coming next for us and our B Corps. Throughout this series, we'll explore the certification process, hear firsthand from B Corps who have taken the leap, and break down what it really means to use business as a force for good. I'm your host, Lauren Everett, and today we are kicking things off with a very special guest, none other than B Lab US and Canada's CEO, Jorge Fontanez.
Thank you, Lauren, for inviting me to the first episode.
This new venture for us, this is new territory.
It is.
For us. And we created this podcast to talk to our existing B Corps, to prospective B Corps, and to consumers, people who are seeing the circle B on the back of their products, who are banking with B Corps. And I'm excited
Me
to
too.
kick this off with you.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's do it.
All right. I asked you to summarize a B Corp in 5 words or less, but let's get down to business.
Okay.
And share with us what a B Corp is and what does B Lab US and Canada do?
Sure. So first, as I mentioned, B Corps are better for the world. And so the natural question then is why? And so B Lab is the nonprofit engine behind the standards that are used by companies to assess themselves and then ultimately certify against those standards. We see ourselves as being one of the most comprehensive standards on the planet, literally, in the way that fair trade helps to certify coffee companies and ensure fair trade practices for growers, or the LEED certification supports the built environment and ensuring that buildings are safe for the people that inhabit them.
Right.
We also connect to those standards that exist. And so we tend to be viewed as the most comprehensive, not just in terms of addressing environmental, social, and governance issues, which are absolutely within our ecosystem, but from the framework of stakeholders, which I'll come back to.
Okay.
The way that I like to think about B Corps is in 3 parts. First, the origin story behind B Lab was to create a set of performance standards that didn't exist, in fact, back in 2006. So we're on this 20-year journey now of demonstrating that purpose and profit can actually coexist.
Right.
And our standards are the product that represent that. What is a performance standard? A performance standard is and actually is used to help companies be held to account for how they are measuring their impact on the world and on the stakeholders that they affect. That would include workers, the community, suppliers. And then we also talk about governance as a structure within that stakeholder framework, and also the environment. And this is also in response to more traditional business, I'll call it business school thinking, because I came from that world.
Yes.
Where shareholders have reigned for decades in the scheme of how companies operate, meaning that the sole purpose of the corporation is to benefit shareholders. Shareholder primacy being what we exist to prove should not be true, right? Because a company has much greater impact on the world and on people than just ensuring that it delivers earnings to shareholders.
Right.
And so the first part of performance standards is an important part of the definition of what it means to be a B Corp. And that was the first 10 years. The second 10 years was establishing what we call the legal requirement. But in more simple terms, it's an alternative corporate structure. It is the way in which we lock the mission for companies to make decisions for the benefit of all stakeholders.
Okay.
Right? So that tension around shareholders versus stakeholders in some ways gets resolved by the legal structure that we call a public benefit corporation. And we can talk more about that. I'm sure we will.
Yes.
So the third part of what it means to be a B Corp that is also important speaks to the future of our movement. And I know we're going to talk about what it means to be a movement, a community
yes.
of companies working together. Our vision of the future is to create an economic system that is equitable, regenerative, and inclusive, right? If that is what we believe, then we also should be talking about how the rules of the game need to change, how policies operate more for the benefit of companies and shareholders than they do for workers or suppliers or the communities writ large. That's the way I talk about what it means to be a B Corp. It is a performance standard that holds companies to account. It is a legal structure that locks in the mission, helping boards of directors and management make decisions for the benefit of all stakeholders. And then there's this third piece that we're just starting to prove out, which is how companies affect policy.
This is why I asked about the 5 words.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about what it means to be a B Corp, what B Lab does,
Right.
it is very nuanced. We're doing a lot. All of it is important, but I'm curious to hear from you. When you say a regenerative economy, what exactly does that mean in layman's terms?
So one, I want to acknowledge what you just said.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you asked me to explain what a B Corp is, and it took me however long it took me to explain what has been created. And I think there's importance to that. It's important for us to reflect on the legacy and what's been created. The reason why I went back to the origin story is because founding B Corps, something like 85 or so companies that committed to being part of this community and to use the standards, as we discussed earlier, came together and signed what we call the Declaration of Interdependence. And for anyone who spent some time with it, the thing that strikes me about the words in that declaration is that companies should operate as if all people and places mattered. So my shorter answer to your question of what does it mean to create a regenerative economy is to leave the planet better than you found it, is to create policies, practices that are less extractive, if not extractive at all, but actually improve the ecosystem in which we exist. The unfortunate truth about capitalism is that it has been built on the premise that companies can take whatever resources they need to create a profit. And that's what we're looking to combat. And I think the vision of creating a regenerative economy allows us to dream differently and to question how the rules that have been created not only need to change, but also how do we co-create a new kind of economy, believing that the people that are most affected by the practices of companies should likely play a role in creating that new future.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, because when we're internally talking about B Corps and we talk about people in the planet,
Right.
a lot of our focus tends to go to employees or the community that the B Corp serve. But I'm interested to know, what role do consumers play in equalizing and regenerating this economy that we all participate in?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, every business looks to create a customer base, right? I grew up as a traditional marketer,
Yes.
right? So, we were joking about how I learned how to create strategies for companies and brands to grow and build their business at the highest price,
Yep.
maximizing profits and selling those products more often to more people. That's the premise of marketing, right? And prior to coming into B Lab, I was in the classroom having exactly these kinds of conversations about how does the discipline need to evolve? And my answer to that is that customers are important, yes. And we as responsible business leaders should be taking more time to understand what kind of behavior we're creating in an economy that is dependent on consumption. I would get challenged by this with my students every year
Okay.
at the beginning of my class because, perceived or real, some would say that marketing is what got us into this mess.
Sure. I get that a lot as a
Right?
worker.
I get that a lot.
Yep.
Yes. So then my question is, well, how does the discipline need to evolve in order to create this new kind of system? And I think one answer to that is that we need to look at the entire value chain. Customers play an important role in creating a sustainable business. So that means if we agree that financial sustainability is important to all of us, then I think the conversation we want to have is about growth. What does good growth look like?
I want to back up just a little bit because we were talking about your background in marketing, and I'm curious to know how you got to B Lab in the first place. What was the
Oh, yeah.
appeal for you?
So I think the context matters because I was approached by the board at B Lab during the pandemic. And so, for many of us as a society, we were grappling with what it would mean to come out of the pandemic and how we would successfully think through community care, but also like, what did this mean for business also? And what was the role of business? And one of the things that I reflect on in that moment was how much innovation was sparked through the pandemic, right? Just the one clear example for me is in the development of the vaccine and how quickly that was brought to market. And when you look at the players that came together, public, private sectors coming together to innovate, to come to a health solution that was good for everyone, I think that's what we're about, right? And I want to go back to those moments actually, because I feel like we've lost sense for where we are as a community, and there are lessons to be learned from that moment. Why were they coming to me? They were one, looking for new leadership at B Lab US and Canada. The network was going through its own evolution. The region was being established as a separate independent entity. And I was frankly just engaged in conversations with the leadership to understand more. I was feeling really good where I was, both in my academic world and also as a consultant to social enterprise companies. But something about the opportunity really spoke to me because I saw within the strategy a theory of change that really aligned with my values. And that's been, in some ways, my career path has been a journey in identifying and saying yes to those opportunities that feel most in alignment with my values. It is one of the reasons why I said yes to B Lab. And it also presented a real challenge because our theory of change required us to think about how would we create this economic system in a way for our region to prioritize the three things that we think are prerequisites for companies to contribute to that vision. And that's to adopt stakeholder governance, to take climate action and do so in an equitable way that creates reparative justice to communities most affected by historical harms done by companies that have been historically extractive. And then third, really addressing in a robust and meaningful way the growing challenges of inequality in this country that are reinforced and exacerbated by the structure of race and the history of race.
There are many things that you just said that I want to come back to, namely aligning your personal values with the values of a company that you work for. And we're going to come back to the theory of change.
Okay.
But to set the stage, because I want to make it clear for our listeners,
Yes.
there's B Lab Global, which is the certification body, and then there's B Lab US and Canada.
Yes.
Talk to us about the distinction between the two.
Yeah. I mean, we are one organization in the sense that we're all working towards the same vision and mission. B Lab US and Canada is one of 7 global partners around the world. And what's most important about the distinction between the two entities is that B Lab Global oversees the development of the standards. And we nurture the community of companies that meet those standards. That is our primary role today, is nurturing and growing that community, and ensuring that we have good separation between the influence of where the standards go is really important for the integrity of the standards as well.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue
Yes,
because our standards are going through an evolution process.
that's right.
And this is not new for us, right? But I think the way that they are being presented to the community now is much different than we've ever seen before. We already get the feedback or the constructive criticism that the standards are very rigorous
Mhm.
and as they should be.
Mhm.
But now, even more so, the bar is being raised. So, what does that mean for existing B Corps and what does that mean for prospective B Corps?
Yeah. So you mentioned that the standards have changed, right? It's not the first time. And so it is important to say that there are 6 versions of the standard since B Lab was founded, and that's been in the spirit of continuous improvement, right? Us ensuring that the standards keep up with public expectation, but also local laws and regulations. Where we're headed is, we call it the evolution of the standards, is to redefine what it means to be a B Corp, is the way that I think about it. So I talked earlier about how our work is about understanding the impact that companies have on stakeholders. And that's essentially how the standards were structured up to now,
Okay.
right? There are 5 dimensions of stakeholders, each of which is represented in our B impact assessment. And a company looks to evaluate both the risks and concerns to those stakeholders, but also where there might be value created. Where we're headed is a set of minimum requirements. And this feels not just transformative, but so meaningful in a way that what we get to say in the next 3 to 5 years is that B Corps stand for more equitable practices in the workplace. B Corps stand for climate action and environmental stewardship. B Corps stand for acting collectively to change policy. I'm just referencing a few of our impact topics. The critical nature of the requirements does change the expectations for current B Corps, because it used to be that you could achieve certification by achieving a score. I won't talk too much about the
Yes.
scoring process, but the point is that there's a score, a minimum score of 80 that every company needs to achieve. And how you got there could be in a myriad of ways. We're now saying you need to hit these minimum requirements no matter your areas of focus.
Right.
And oh, by the way, these are the 10 areas of focus that every B Corp needs to focus on.
How does that even the playing field for all B Corps? Because I know here in the US and Canada, we're approaching, if not already at 2,500 B Corps in
Yes.
the US and Canada. So how does that impact how our smaller and medium B Corps improve upon their impact when some could argue, and rightfully so, that the standards are already rigorous enough and you all are asking us to do more? How do we as an organization support them in that?
Yes. It's true, right? That standards are rigorous by nature. And part of our work has been to understand how to make our standards and the certification process more accessible to all businesses of all
Right.
all sizes, especially, but also of many ownership structures, right? Recognizing that there are many segments of the country that are underrepresented within the B Corp community still today. So how are we addressing this? I think this is probably the biggest opportunity for us, is to actually upskill as a team. So we're educating ourselves on the new versions of the standards actively so that we can upskill the community and support the transition. I would say that there are at least 2 components of the philosophy moving forward. One is leave no B Corp behind.
Leave no B Corp.
We are not trying to create a set of standards
Yes.
that creates a new elite set of companies. That is not what this is about. This is about making more progress, but it's also not about perfection. So we will have failed if we create a set of standards that is unattainable. And so starting with our B Corp community requires us to understand, how do we help them meet those requirements? And that's exactly what we're setting out to do. There's a question you asked about prospects. Maybe we'll take that separately.
Yeah.
I think there's more for us still to think about, and there's lots of opportunities as well for how we position certification to companies that have yet to adopt certification.
I want to go back to the distinction between B Lab Global and B Lab US and Canada.
Yes.
And
Did I answer it? No.
yes, you did.
Okay,
You
all right,
did. But
okay.
I think there's a component that we can dig a little deeper into, and that is the theory of change.
Okay.
First of all, what is B Lab US and Canada's theory of change, and how does that work in tandem with the standards?
So I mentioned earlier that I was recruited on a strategy that articulated our theory of change being about companies adopting stakeholder governance, focusing on more just practices alongside climate action, and then also, I would say, closing the wealth gap with respect to racial equity. So I've been in this role for 4 years. And I'd like to believe, and I think there's some truth to it, is that the next version of the standards incorporates aspects of our work from our region. And we can begin to point to where in the standards, the evolution of the standard, actually, we can do that already today. The team has done a lot of mapping in terms of how our desired outcomes or along those 3 pillars are reflected within our standards today. And there's even more opportunity to show that in the evolution of the standards. And we're going to be designing upskilling programs and curriculum to support companies in that journey as well.
Yeah. I want us to take our listeners through what certification looks like. And we're going to dig deeper into it throughout the season when we sit down with B Corps who've gone through certification, gone through recertification. But for those listening and interested in becoming a B Corp, what does that process look like?
The first easy step is to access our B Impact Assessment. We call it the BIA, as you know. And it is an open source tool that any company can go to our website, wearebcorps.com,
Yes.
to begin the process.
For free.
For free.
Mhm.
Yes.
Mhm.
An important note. That's the beginning of a journey with us. And what I would say about what we know about companies that take that step is that there are hundreds of thousands, literally more companies that have accessed the BIA for free than there are B Corps, right?
Yeah.
So something close to 300,000 companies have accessed the BIA over the course of the last 20 years. And there's something that we're still learning from what that means and trying to dig more into the data. But because it's available for free and because it is an assessment, it does offer a lot of value for companies to understand how their company impacts the world, right? And that's probably the simplest way for us to think about it. Then there's the technical pieces of like, how do you then, once you submit your assessment, what happens after that?
Right.
I'm really grateful to know that a lot of energy and time has been spent over the last 3 years nurturing a pipeline and shortening the wait times for companies to complete an initial evaluation and then ultimately a verification of what has been submitted. And then on the other side of that is a certification, right? And so what I think is most important for our listeners to understand is that we support companies in the first part of that journey through to submission. And there are lots we could talk about the ways that our team supports that. But on the other side, that relationship to B Lab Global you're asking me to point to, B Lab Global oversees the verification process.
Right.
And that's an important distinction because that's where we want to ensure that there's separation around the decisions made to ensure that a company achieves certification. That decision does not sit with us.
Right. Okay. I like that distinction. And I would love to get into what the assessment of the companies who are submitting looks like. I know in layman's terms, we are saying you want us, or we're asking you to come with receipts. Are you who you say you are? And are you doing what you're saying you're doing? Right? How does B Lab actually assess a company's impact on workers and the community and customers and the environment?
Well, I mean, I think partly what you're asking is maybe, I don't know that you're asking me to get very technical here, but as we've established the 5 dimensions in which the assessment is structured, right? So just going back to it for a moment, what's the impact on your customers? What's the impact on your workers as well as your suppliers? What is your governance structure? And then how do you impact the environment? Let's just take customers and environment as an example. How you price, right, can play into your assessment. how you market your products. And this is becoming increasingly a conversation as regulations, not in the US, but in Europe, are addressing the more recent concerns around greenwashing to create their own regulations or standards to ensure that marketers are marketing with truth and that claims are verified. And so we can play a role in that process in supporting companies and helping to validate, like you said, bring receipts
Bringing receipts.
to ensure that how they're marketing their products is in fact supported with documentation. And so, yes, our assessment and the verification process requires us to look more deeply into those practices.
Right.
The other example I might tee up is just around the environment, right? So it's more common for companies that are wanting to be more sustainable to be measuring their greenhouse gases. And so one good way that we've invested in this is one through community, which I hope we get to talk about,
Yes.
community of B Corps, but also through by aligning ourselves with the Science-Based Target Initiative and the Climate Disclosure Project, so that we're not duplicating or replicating efforts in the ecosystem. And so that just means that from an environmental standpoint, we're asking you, have you set targets? Have you created a plan to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions? What progress have you made against those? And show us the documentation, show us the receipts.
Yes.
Yeah.
Beyond the distinction of B Lab Global and B Lab US and Canada, we create resources, we create programs for impact improvement. And I want to dig into what those programs look like, specifically level. And actually, I'm going to take it back a little further. Before we started recording, we were talking about the size of our company and the
Yes.
fact that there are about 40.
The size of B Lab US and Canada.
The size of B Lab US and Canada, there are about 40 of us. And yet we are doing very expansive work. We have a lot of offerings, but we have a lot of help with the help of consultants. So what role do consultants play in creating programs like Level in order to diversify our community and make the offering of certification more accessible?
So one thing I love about our ecosystem and our community is that consultants keep us honest and they also give us, I want to say, more capacity to support the growing community. So what do I mean by that? So one is there are now, I don't even know what the number is. I'm going to say hundreds of consulting companies whose a majority of their business is supporting companies through the certification journey. You talked about the rigorous nature of the certification or the standards themselves. And so what that also means is that there are some real resources that every company, no matter how small or how large, have to invest in order to bring the receipts.
Yes.
Right. So consultants play a role in helping us improve how we do that. They also help us inform how we can innovate around programs. So we have consultants who we often bring in to talk about how their curriculum is helping companies get to 80, for example, right? I think part of what we know our role is demystifying the process
Yes.
and not intentionally making it hard, but making it accessible. So you mentioned Level.
Yeah.
Level is a program that's all about creating equitable access to our certification. And what we've learned over the years is that if we want to create an economic system that is in fact equitable and inclusive, then it must also be representative of at least the fastest growing segment of entrepreneurs, which is Black women in the US, right? And if we took the numbers and we looked at Canada, we would also know and need to recognize that it's important that we are respectful of Indigenous practices, but also asking ourselves how we are engaging the Indigenous community in Canada. So here's our opportunity, is to start to look at the numbers, and we have baseline data that tells us less than 10% of the community of B Corps still today, it hasn't moved a lot in my short tenure here, are Black, are Indigenous, are people of color, but also veterans and people with disabilities. These are the most marginalized amongst us, and also oftentimes the most innovative and fast growing. And so it behooves us to engage these segments of the business sector that are contributing to the growth of quality jobs and also are the future of economic spending. That's why Level was created,
Right.
right? That's why the Level program exists, is for us to first assess how do companies that are self-identifying from one of those segments, how do they relate to our standards? How do they relate to the certification process? And the one thing that was more obvious to us is that it takes time and resources. And if we want to level the playing field, then we should find a way to bring those resources to the fore.
Yeah.
Thankfully, we're in our 5th cohort now for Level. We've learned some things about how to scale it. We're expanding into local regions with Level, which is super exciting, so that we might bring more awareness to our communities about the benefits of certification, and also continue to refine how we show up and how we improve our offerings with the support of consultants, of course, because as you said, we're a small and mighty team of 40.
Yes.
And so scale looks like engaging and building trust with our community and with consultants.
Yeah, you said something about demystifying, and I want to know, are there any misconceptions that come up readily for you that you want to demystify?
An important thing for us to underscore about our work is that, I talked about us being, or the standards being, a performance standard. In the ecosystem of standards bodies, it is important to distinguish that we are not a disclosure standard. A lot of the other standards that exist require companies to bring receipts to an extent.
Okay.
They get to self-report and identify information based on a framework, other frameworks.
Okay.
We're going farther than that, right? We're working in a way that requires companies to demonstrate that they're doing what they say they're doing. And then every 3 years when they recertify, they're having to show improvement from the prior certification. And I think that's what makes us different, and is something that maybe helps to demystify and bust the myths around why we're different.
Right, right. Because you named earlier a number of certification bodies like Fair Trade. You have 1% for the planet.
Right.
There are a lot of, I don't want to say competition because they're all valuable, but looking at the circle B, at the bottom of websites and on the back of products, what is the benefit of becoming a certified B Corp?
Yeah, I mean, 2 reasons that really come to the top every time. First is employees looking for their leadership to complete the certification process. Why? Because we now have generations of workers that look to reassure themselves that their company's values align with theirs, and the B Corp certification is one way to do that. And so for a lot of companies that choose to certify, they're doing so because they want to retain their talent, and they also want to attract the best talent as well. The other is actually in the investor community. I think we don't talk a lot about this, and it might be in this kind of wave of green hushing,
Sure.
because there's a lot of anti-alphabet stuff circling around us.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, the alphabet is under attack, is what I was saying last year. But what's true is that for most companies and investors and asset managers and private equity companies that have any interest in understanding sustainability, they see it first through the lens of risk,
Okay.
right? If you're an insurance company today, you know that climate is a thing.
Of
Climate change is a thing.
Yeah.
Right? And we have so much evidence about how the insurance sector is changing its practices, making it really hard for many communities to insure their homes. That's a whole separate topic, but it's an important way to highlight, the opportunity we get to create change within the economic system as well.
Yeah. Where I want to go next is tangible success. of
Yes.
what it means to be a B Corp?
I think one of the things that is the holy grail of this entire sector is return on investment for certification. We
Absolutely.
can't be talk about add some more letters into the mix, right? So let's talk about ROI.
Let's talk about
Let's talk about
Mhm.
ROI. I would love it if one day we can show how over time the companies that have achieved certification create sustainable growth and have better margins and better bottom lines than the rest. We're not quite there yet. We're
Okay.
not quite able to tell that story yet. And there's a lot of reasons for that.
Okay.
But it's the holy grail of sustainability, and it has been for some time. I think examples that I'm proud to talk about, that we're proud to talk about, are some of our Black-led companies, especially who certify. So, Partake Cookies and Black and Bold Coffee Company have achieved immense growth since certification.
Mhm.
And part of the reason why is because of their partnerships, each of them uniquely with Ben& and Jerry's, also a B Corp
Yes.
within the Unilever umbrella
Mhm.
of companies.
Mhm.
That's a really interesting proof point for us to kind of dig into what it means for companies that are values aligned to work together to create new kinds of products and offerings and create an economic system of their own to be able to grow in a sustainable way. And I hope that we could tell many more of those stories
Yeah.
over the coming years.
Mhm.
I think it's also important to talk about the other side of the spectrum, right? Because I mentioned Ben& and Jerry's in that partnership. So the other company I think is worth talking about is Seventh Generation. So they are a longstanding B Corp that continues to raise the bar also in terms of how they come to support the community and its evolution and engagement around advocacy. But also one of the more interesting things to me about what they've helped us do is to think about what we call scope 3 in the climate space,
Okay.
which is the supply chain aspect of most companies and the impact of the supply chain on the environment. They took that same lens and looked at their finances.
Okay.
And I really, and that's actually really influenced how we have nurtured a community around climate finance to move money, significant amount of money through a cohort learning model whereby something close to $60 billion of investments, either in retirement or in checking accounts and cash or in other investments held by something like 45 companies participating in these cohorts, are moving that money to what we would call low carbon intensive solutions. More than $1 trillion worth of investments fund fossil fuels. If we are to create the level of economic systems change that we imagine and desire, we must be looking at scope 3. We must be talking about how we move our money. And so Seventh Generation has created what they call a fingerprint in relation to the flow of money. And our climate finance cohort will soon be sharing learnings about how B Corps could do the same.
Mhm. Now, I like to think of B Corps as disruptivators. And
Okay.
I didn't coin that term, but it's yes, disrupting, innovating, and to do business differently, you have to look on a much larger scale. And I would imagine that there is a policy aspect to this work. So, how are we working with policymakers to hold businesses accountable at a larger scale?
Sure. Yes. Well, building on that Seventh Generation example, I mean, what they have helped us do is engage better with community-based organizations in states like New York to help show how companies can engage in climate action. And in fact, New York is one of the very few states that have a very comprehensive bill that looks to invest in green infrastructure and create a green job economy in the state. And so we, in partnership with not just Seventh Generation, but many other community-based organizations and other companies, have been learning from that. And we've taken it to other states. So most recently with the LA fires, it's going to be really interesting to see what comes of it. But we know that the severity of drought in the West Coast and the dangers of the level of water in our reservoirs are creating the conditions for companies to act differently and for communities to ask or if not demand something different from companies that are the most extractive. Fossil fuel companies are those is in fact that sector which will continue to be scrutinized not just by regulators but also by the public. And so there is a bill called the Polluters Pay Act, which looks to hold fossil fuel companies accountable for the costs of recovering from events like the wildfires in Los Angeles.
Okay.
We'll be supporting that bill. Also, the same model, alongside community-based organizations with B Corps in tow, but also with other companies in the region.
Yeah, that's phenomenal work. I want to pivot us to a very nuanced topic, but something that I think deserves us holding space for and
Yes.
making time to speak about. And you kind of alluded to this earlier when you mentioned greenwashing, but it is that of multinational corporations
Yes.
or MNCs. And I've been at B Lab for a couple of years now. Started at the top of 2022. I believe in that same year is when the conversation started to um, evolve and become a little bit more consistent with the certification of Nespresso and Nestle Health Sciences. And most recently, there has been a very popular, vocal, and longstanding B Corp that announced its decertification. And MNCs was a very large part of that decision. And it sent shockwaves through our community. I think it took a lot of people by surprise, right? And from when I was looking at the commentary, the skepticism, the criticism, there was a fair argument, at least from my perspective, on both sides of the scrutiny, or at least like the skepticism of allowing MNCs to certify. And the conversation is about, if we're allowing these companies to certify, does it dilute the certification? Does it dilute the standards, the brand? And my marketing brain started to tingle.
Yes.
And there was let's just say like a campaign slogan that
Yes.
came to mind for me. And it is, anyone is invited to measure their impact, but everyone won't meet the standard. That is for small businesses, medium, and MNCs alike.
Yes.
We talked about the B impact assessment being free and accessible to anyone, whether you are looking to certify or not. Anyone can log in and measure their impact. But once you go down the journey of certification, you have to meet a minimum number to certify. And then every 3 years to recertify.
That's right.
So I'm curious, from your perspective, what is your feeling on this skepticism of us inviting more B Corp or MNCs to certify? How does that impact the brand and the standards as a whole?
Okay. Full disclosure moment.
Yes.
You know this about me, but maybe most people don't. I came from the world of multinational companies.
Okay.
And so there's a philosophy that brings me to this work, which is that in order to change the economic system, in order to create the level and scale of change that we imagine, I think it must include the largest companies amongst us. Why? Because those companies hold and have decisions over a great number of resources
Right.
that we're trying to shift and change. What do you think about that? Because I'm curious to hear your perspective when I say that, but also maybe what within the debate are you sitting with?
Well, from my perspective, I agree with what you're saying. MNCs have much larger reach. They have much larger visibility. However, I think that, sure, everyone is being held to the same standard when it comes to certification. But I think in regards to greenwashing, and when we're really looking at holding these companies accountable, is an extra step that I think is required because of the scale of these companies. So when you look at Nestle Health Sciences, there's so many companies under that umbrella. How do we, as a certification body and also as a community, hold these companies responsible with making the brand, making the certification more accessible,
Yes.
but making sure that it is still held to that
Yes.
higher standard. So I think that there is responsibility on both our side as the certification body, but also on the community.
For sure.
Hmm.
Accountability is not just important, it really does define the community that we exist in.
Yes, they always hold us accountable as they should.
As they should.
Hmm.
And because we want to maintain the integrity of our standards, it's important to say a couple things. One, we talked about bringing the receipts, right? So we go through the process of verification for all companies. I think one thing that might be important to say is that while the standards are global in nature and all companies need to meet the standards are actually not the same for every company
Okay.
because they change and adapt to size, complexity, region, and sector. That's so much deeper than we have time to get into. I know you know that. And so I think that is where we could spend more time,
Okay.
is unpacking what are the additional requirements that multinational companies have to work through in order to achieve certification. One example that I just want to tee up as well, because Danone worldwide has been on a multi-year journey that I think is nearing a decade long
Okay.
in working to certify its subsidiaries around the globe. And it's not to hold up Danone to some high, perch alongside any other company in the community who rightly so should feel good about holding the B Corp trademark. What I want us to begin to do once Danone has completed its certification around the world 100% is to engage in dialogue, is to ask the hard questions. And I think that Danone and others, including leadership that I get to talk to,
Right.
that I know many others do not have that access, but there's an openness amongst leaders in the B Corp community, again, large or small, to learning from each other. Our role at B Lab US in Canada is to be that connector and convener.
Yeah.
I wish that we would be able to bring everyone along through the next evolution of our standards, as I shared before, right?
Mhm.
Leave no B Corp behind. And I know that there are strongly held beliefs within our community and with those companies who think we should do something different about how we structure the standards in the future. That kind of dialogue and disagreement is welcome.
Mhm.
And we're aiming for progress, not perfection. And so part of what I think we will see over the coming years is a change in the composition of who is in the B Corp community, not only for some, and I think there are very few who are um, perhaps not on board with the future direction, but we have gone through multi-year stakeholder engagement with our community, and survey after survey, B Corps tell us that they are broadly in support of the direction. And so what that means for us is that we're moving in the right direction, and we're not going to satisfy everyone. And so then our question is, what is the alternative? Right? I believe so much in what has been created that we, in fact, not only have a community, but we've built a movement of companies that are willing to mobilize together in response to current action and to shape policy in the future. That kind of community doesn't really exist anywhere. And so it would be sad for us to see any company decertify because they're not supportive of the direction. But I would also ask that we at B Lab reflect on what can we do differently to support companies, because certification is a tool of change.
Right.
But as you've mentioned, we have created around the world a whole series of programs for companies to engage in. And I think the world is better off with more companies adopting better business practices than spending our lifetimes trying to get every company to become a B Corp.
I would say we can end it right there, but I do have a couple more questions.
Yes, please.
Because that was a great response to that. Let's get into some headlines,
All
some
right.
news.
Yes.
So we were talking before we started about the surge of AI and how the tech sector is underrepresented within the B Corp community, but there is opportunity for us to continue evolving our standards to welcome
Yes.
them into the community and hold them accountable
Yes.
to this work. What does that look like?
So I think this is an opportunity to talk about how there are some sectors that we either don't certify in or that we don't yet have the standards to allow for that kind of assessment to be completed. And artificial intelligence and algorithmic based companies using large language models, those standards don't exist anywhere
Right.
yet.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
Yet. So then the question is like, how do we play a role in that? With respect to AI, I think where the conversation sits today, that's in the news, is about how companies that are being positioned as a public benefit, how should they then look to their own governance structure to reinforce the values that they espouse? The public benefit corporation today, we still believe, is the best model of a governance structure that says that a business can make decisions for a public benefit. And what's true about that policy and that corporate structure is that a company can decide what that public benefit is.
Okay.
So the debate in AI and the tech sector, I think, is super interesting because we're basically talking either about a future that is augmented by AI and technology that allows us to work less and still grow our economy. Ooh, I love that.
I know.
I love that. The other side of the spectrum is a dystopian world that is taken over by robots, to put it
Right. Yes.
simply, right?
Mhm.
Where everyone doesn't get to participate, where digital blockchains actually create more systems and barriers of access than the ones that exist today. That's not the future that we're about, right? So how do we get in front of that? I don't have the answer, but I think one of the more important conversations that we want to weigh in on is how governance actually can play a pivotal role.
Yeah. To be determined.
Oh, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, another headline that we're seeing, specifically here in the US, is we as an organization and B Corps are not immune
Mm.
to our current political climate. And there has been a lot of pushback on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and also environmental social governance efforts. And I have the privilege of talking to B Corps often. And one thing that resonates is we're standing 10 toes down in this
Mm.
work. We're approaching it differently to continue to sustain the work, but we're not stopping it. So how is B Lab US and Canada supporting B Corps in doing this work, and how is it impacting us and our vision
Yes.
moving forward?
Well, I want to say more than just B Lab US in Canada. I want to say for B Lab and for anyone interested to go deeper into the evolution of the standards, one of the impact areas is to have companies focus very much on what equity and inclusion means for them. And that is, to me, a very transformative path for us as a community because we have prioritized it within the standards. We also are staying the course, right? In a moment in the US where, yes, language is being politicized, but what I believe to be true is that the work has not changed. And yes, I want to stay rooted not only in truth and the lived experience of Black people and Indigenous wisdom to help us get through, because what we also know is that these conversations, these struggles, these fights for civil and human rights, these things are not new.
Right.
We can celebrate how far we have come, because of so many who have sacrificed before us. I think our role in this moment is to protect what has been created in any way we can. And someone recently in the community who also works within our team said something really interesting to me, which is that what is being politicized isn't necessarily political. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that we get to shape, we are storytellers.
Yes, we are.
We get to shape the narrative. We get to tell the story. When we're talking about basic human and civil rights and our ability to be free anywhere in the world, these are not political issues. These are inherent rights that we have as a humanity.
Yes.
So our ability to stay rooted on our 10 toes, stay grounded in these things, I think does not require us to take political stances. It requires us to operate as if all people and places matter.
Another place where we could end it there, and we're getting close. I want to wrap up our conversation because, we could go another hour or two.
Yes. We'll take it to dinner.
Yes. I want to tap you on the shoulder for some advice for those listeners who are toying with the idea of evolving their business model, or who have been doing the work since the inception of their business but are looking to measure and come with receipts. What advice do you have for them on starting their B Corp journey?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the benefits of not being a B Corp, if you're starting your journey, is just to connect with other leaders, right? And so we have 30 local chapters across the US and Canada today. We've got 50 networks. Most of the events that are organized by those, leaders locally are for B Corps, but also non-B Corps attend all the time. And I think in partnership with our networks, we will see more and more engagement with prospects and anyone who's interested. And I've traveled the country, as you know. We both have been in conversation with B Corps, but I also get to talk to a lot of prospects who, register for a B Corp conference because they're interested to know. So I think that's what I would say is like, we are first and foremost a community. Find your local B Corp community chapter and create relationships to dispel the myths about what it means to certify. But also take time. I think if you're a small and medium-sized business leader as well, and I want to, maybe this is a shout out to business leaders in states that are perhaps not as friendly to some of the issues that we were talking about before. I would say we have community across the country today that are committed to helping other business leaders learn and also care for their workers. I think if there's anything that we can come together in solidarity and unite around, is that every business leader wakes up every day not only concerned about the well-being of their business, but also of their workers. And to the extent that our workers' safety and human and civil rights are threatened, we are failing our workers if we are not doing more. And I think maybe that's our opportunity, is to continue to build the roadmaps for B Corps and non-B Corps to unify and to come together and to learn from one another, to be values aligned and protect what's good for the benefit of all people on the planet.
Jorge, thank you for joining.
Lauren, thank you.
You're welcome.
Your leadership in this moment, but also for as many years as we've come to know each other, is so important. And so thanks for creating the space for me to join.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us and embarking on this new journey for us. If you are interested in learning more about B Corps or how to start your B Corp certification by using
wearebcorps.com.
Yes, by using our free B Impact Assessment tool, visit weareBcorps.com. And we'll see you in the next episode. Bye, y'all.
Bye.